All right, well, look, we might make a start. I know that there are people still arriving, but we have a fantastic presentation that we're really keen to get going with. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Disaster Governance, Collaboration and Community Organising A Gendered Perspective webinar. It's fantastic to see so many all members, friends and allies here today. To open today's webinar, I would of course like to acknowledge country. All recognises the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. All recognises the unique role of Maori and embraces the Treaty of Waitangi as New Zealand's foundation document, confirming Maori as the first people of New Zealand. It recognises that they have absolute authority and sovereignty over their lands, resources and treasured possessions, while embracing the three guiding principles of the Te Tiriti: partnership, participation and protection. For those of you who are new today, this is the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. We are a network of women allies and friends, and we work to promote, support and recognise women in the emergency management and disaster resilience sector. We've got almost 2,000 members across Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific, and we provide our members with a range of benefits, including events like today's. Just some housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, so you'll be able to go back and watch it again. If you have to leave early, you can come back and finish it off, and of course share it with your friends and colleagues. So today we've got a presentation by our special guests, and we're going to be following that with an open discussion or Q&A. What I would encourage you to do is to put your questions in the chat. We have had a huge number of registrations to today's event, and I don't think we're going to be able to quite manage an open discussion with people putting their hands up. So please use the chat to pop your questions in as you think of them and as they arise through the presentations. But enough from me. I'm here to introduce our two special guests, Rebecca McNaught and Emma Pittaway. Normally I would provide a bit of a biography of our special guests, but I'm actually going to hand over and ask them to introduce themselves. And perhaps I'll start with you, Rebecca. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Bridget. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for having us along. So just a quick introduction about myself. I've spent the last 2 decades working on climate change adaptation and disaster management in international contexts, mostly in the Pacific Islands, but also across Asia and the Middle East regions. I spent 9 years working with the Red Cross internationally and 4 years with the United Nations Development Programme. The rest I've been working as an independent consultant, working with for example, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and the Australian Government's International Aid Program. So about 5 years ago, I started working on my PhD when we moved back to Australia, and I just submitted that a few weeks ago, which I'm very happy about. And it was about the local level collaboration for climate and disaster resilience, focusing on the Northern Rivers and the Pacific Islands. The floods occurred about halfway through my data collection, and that really changed my trajectory. I worked with a lot of people locally in that disaster response and recovery context over the last couple of years. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I did look at gender as a theme within my research, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to dig into that a little bit more deeply today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And what an amazing background you've got. We're really lucky to have you here today. Emma, over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Bridget. I so appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation about gender in the Australian disaster response. To give a little background about myself, I work for the University Centre for Rural Health in Lismore, And I first became involved in disaster research after the 2017 Lismore floods, when I had the opportunity to work on a small study about the flood experiences of residents. And because I have a background in community development, the organic community-led response really piqued my interest. And then if we fast forward to the catastrophic events that happened in our region in 2022, which was not just floods, but major landslides across 6 local government areas, I lived through that event as a community member, and I was involved in the informal, immediate community response. And then a few months later, I was able to help Beck with her PhD research, which she's going to talk about today, by interviewing a few women from my local community who were instrumental in that grassroots response. And a few months after that, I had the opportunity to join a team of researchers at the University Centre for Rural Health and the Sydney Environment Institute based at Sydney University, just beginning an 18-month study of community-led response to disasters in New South Wales. So I want to make clear at the outset that I am no expert on gender in disasters, but when Beck asked me if I'd like to co-present today, my immediate thought was, this is such an important conversation and it is one that we need to be having in Australia. I've worked in gender analysis in the international refugee and women's rights contexts. So the lack of discussion about gender in disaster and resilience here in Australia has been conspicuous. So I'm here today to bring my own reflections to this important conversation, and I very much look forward to learning from other contributors as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. And like Rebecca, you know, a really rich background and you bring a lot of insight and expertise with you. I think what's really exciting about the OAR network and having you here today is that there are, you know, members, friends, allies involved in so many different aspects of disaster resilience and emergency management. You know, whether it's frontline lights and sirens, you know, people actually providing, you know, response and safety for communities, through to researchers, policymakers, and of course people with lived experience, you know, which are probably the most important stakeholder of all. And so it's great that you're able to be here today and share with us. I might get the slides going. Thank you so much, Kate, and hand over to you, Rebecca and Emma, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. And Kate, if we could just have a look at the outline of the session. What we'll do today is that I'm going to start with an overview of the Northern Rivers context and gender issues, and I'll then talk about the gender findings from the research that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. I'll then hand over to Beck, and she'll talk about the gender findings from her research, and she'll wrap up with some implications and next steps before we open it out to some discussion at the end. Go to the next slide, please, Kate. So there may be people listening to this who are not familiar with what happened on the Northern Rivers in late February 2022 and then again in late March 2022. The Northern Rivers is a regional part of New South Wales on the east coast of Australia, as you can see here on this map. And in February 2022, it was hit by a catastrophic flood and landslide event that displaced around 1,300 people and was the most expensive natural disaster in Australia's history. And on the next slide, you can see that it was the worst flood in the recorded history of the region, absolutely unprecedented in scale, as this graph shows. So the horizontal black dotted line at the top there that you can see is the 1 in 100 year flood level. If you can go to the next slide, Kate. For those of you who prefer a pictorial presentation, this picture speaks volumes, I think, about the scale of the disaster. So the 1974 floods indicated there were the previous really huge floods that stick in community memory. And this is relevant because the Northern Rivers community had to step up in 2022 and become involved in disaster rescue, response, recovery and adaptation in quite extraordinary ways. And in the context of climate change, this is the course, the new disaster landscape that we all face, where disasters are going to require effective collaboration between the community and formal emergency management sectors because of the scale and frequency of them. And this is also, of course, one of the key lines down which emergency response in Australia is gendered, that the formal response by combat agencies is male-dominated and the community-led response tends to be led by women. So in this next slide, I want to start by touching very briefly on the key gender issues in emergency management literature, because this will frame the discussion of our research findings. Firstly, the impacts of disaster are gendered. That is, women, men, and people of diverse genders and sexual orientations experience disasters differently and unequally. So women experience increased incidence of domestic violence post-disaster. They bear the brunt of caring, emotional support, and community recovery, and they have less economic resilience than men. Men are expected to be protectors and providers, and feel social pressure not to display weakness, which results in them not seeking mental health and can increase suicide risk. And sexual and gender minorities often feel marginalised and unsafe in mainstream spaces and services set up post-disaster, such as evacuation centres. And there's a lack of visibility of queer disaster experience as well, both in the media and in emergency management policy and planning. And this results in a lack of knowledge by emergency management personnel and service providers about what the queer community needs. Secondly, roles and knowledge in disaster response, recovery and adaptation are also often gendered. So in general, women tend to shoulder the burden of post-disaster recovery and community building, while men are more likely to be involved in rescues and staying to defend property. And this is reflected in the organisational structures and cultures of emergency management agencies. So Australian emergency management agencies are highly gendered spaces. Recent studies in Australia describe them as hypermasculine, blokey and boys clubs, which function to exclude women, particularly from leadership positions. And a very telling post-Black Saturday Victorian study showed that 80% of emergency management leadership roles in that state are occupied by men. And finally, but very importantly, Australian emergency management policy until this year has really lacked a gender lens. So despite a strong gender lens in international disaster policy, including the Sendai framework, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience has led the way here in Australia by publishing just this year its first gender and emergency management guidelines. But most Australian disaster policies...
Hey, Matt. Oh, yes, I'm not on. I'm on it.
So if we turn now to the next slide and to the research that I've been involved in over the past couple of years, in August 2022, the University Centre for Rural Health and the Sydney Environment Institute began running a study to better understand community-led disaster organising. This was run across 3 sites in New South Wales. So in addition to the Northern Rivers, we were also studying the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury regions, so the community-led response to both flood and fire. And the project ran over 18 months, in which time we interviewed 69 community organisers across the 3 sites to hear their stories and insights. And we also ran 6 participant gatherings to gain deeper insights and analysis from some of our participants. If you can just go to the next slide, Kate. I think it's important to define the term community-led disaster organising. In our current research, we've broadly defined it to include any flood response that's not aligned with formal emergency management agencies or the formal volunteer sector and is not undertaken as part of a paid role, at least initially. So this includes individuals who simply turned up to help in the aftermath of disasters, community groups or sometimes local businesses who pitched in to the disaster response, and importantly, groups that formed spontaneously and organically in the wake of disasters as local communities scrambled to help themselves in situations where the formal response was overwhelmed by the scale and, you know, couldn't meet demand. In the next slide, we have the research questions we were seeking to answer. So what does community-led disaster organising look like? What role does it play? And what are the supports, enablers, barriers and challenges to community-led disaster organising? And although, sorry, Kate, if you could just flick to the next slide. Although our research wasn't focused on the impacts of disaster, it did confirm some of the trends recognised in the literature about the gendered impacts. So we heard reports of women experiencing sexual assault in evacuation centres, increased incidents of domestic violence, particularly against elderly women, and we heard about women's reliance on men to defend properties and to help them to evacuate properties as well. We also heard a number of reports of men feeling they had to tough it out and not seek mental health support. Interestingly, many of these were sort of secondhand reports by women about the men in their communities. And from the queer community, we heard reports of feeling marginalised and unsafe in evacuation centres, of not feeling comfortable accessing mainstream services, and in the immediate days following disasters, not being able to access gender-affirming medication. However, being focused on the community-led organising, our research had much more to say on the gendered roles adopted post-disaster. And in fact, our findings overwhelmingly support the understanding that roles post-disaster are highly gendered, with men dominating rescue and preparedness activities and women taking the lead in community support, wellbeing and recovery. And this was something that was reflected on by some of our participants. So I've got a couple of quotes here. One Northern Rivers participant reflected, "I've been amazed at how many women have been involved in the response. Yeah, it's quite amazing. I mean, there's some blokes around. I've got to give them some credit, but yeah, it was always the women saying, what do you need? What can I help with? Can I get some fairy lights? Can I do this and that?" Whatever it was. And another participant commented that it's usually women. "I think we're inherently caring and I think we collaborate well. We don't have as much of a power trip going on. We work well together. We're really good problem solvers. Yeah. I know that more men are involved in the initial response phase. They go out and do the rescue." So if you can go to the next slide, please. One of our key findings was how diverse and extensive community activities were. I think our participants reported involvement in every activity you can think of that's part of disaster response, recovery and adaptation. And it will come as little surprise to the present audience that women were overrepresented in almost all of them. So in the list on this slide, the activities in red are the only ones that were predominantly undertaken by men, although women took part in all of them, from boat rescue to running impromptu evacuation centres, to cooking meals, to mental health support, to establishing radio networks. Next slide, please. Some examples of women-led initiatives include multiple local recovery hubs that sprung up when small communities were isolated or cut off by fire, flood or landslides. Many of these continued to provide essential support to their communities for months post-disaster. And in the Northern Rivers, many are still very active today, 2.5 years on. So in one site, a few women with catering and event organising experience banded together to run a community kitchen that provided tens of thousands of meals to the local community following the flood. In another site, a local woman started a community pantry from her house, which became a central node in a web of volunteer support and distribution of supplies when their local area was cut off. In another example, some First Nations women came together to create a culturally safe healing space in recognition of the barriers that many minority groups have accessing mainstream counselling services. In another site, the community-led response was led by existing community organisations, and they had mainly women already in those professional roles. A key finding of our research is that community-led disaster organising plays a specialised, sophisticated and indispensable role. So firstly, it's specialised, because the ways that communities work collectively to address their own needs are unique and they can't be replicated by professional personnel and services. Communities rely on their own internal knowledge, skills, and networks, and often these are connections sustained by women, to identify unique needs and resources. So in one rural community, a few local women got together and mapped their community property by property in order to create a system for conducting welfare checks and accounting for all community members in the absence of emergency services. Community response to needs can be swift and agile. You know, it's unencumbered by bureaucratic decision-making. And intimate knowledge of the community means that it can offer tailored support and safe and accessible spaces. So one member of the queer community described how several people who are qualified in providing mental health support set up an informal service at an evacuation centre by simply sitting on the floor in a corner alongside the evacuees and building rapport with people who didn't feel comfortable talking to the official staff. Secondly, community-led organising is sophisticated because it draws on the professional skills, expertise and experience of community members. So in one example, a woman who is a highly skilled facilitator coordinated the cooperation of community members when they were cut off for over a week, while a fellow woman community member who was a psychologist provided mental health support. And a number of women brought their previous experiences of event organising, community development, advocacy, business management to the development of the initial grassroots community recovery hubs into incorporated resilience groups able to attract small recovery grants down the track. And these examples challenge the prevalent assumption that community involvement in disaster response is a bunch of well-meaning but chaotic individuals descending on the scene post-disaster. And thirdly, indispensable because of the critical role community-led organising plays in major disasters. In many of the local communities we heard about, the formal disaster response simply didn't get there in time. You know, so it was fellow community members rescuing each other off rooftops, feeding and clothing each other, establishing systems on the fly to kickstart the recovery effort. And years on, it's the community groups and networks that are still there when the agencies have left, you know, and these are all predominantly run by women. In a very telling example, we're currently involved in an initiative to create a regional alliance of grassroots community-led disaster groups in the Northern Rivers. And we had our first regional gathering in March, and of close to 100 people who put their names down to be part of a contact list after that initial event, 87% were women. So in the next slide, in terms of the barriers and challenges experienced, the key issue community organisers raised across the 3 sites was a lack of recognition and support for their role by formal emergency management agencies and government. This included emergency management personnel ignoring or sidelining their well-organised responses during and immediately after disasters, not acknowledging and supporting the critical role the community was playing in saving lives and providing basic humanitarian assistance, and in the ongoing recovery, not including grassroots groups and offering them a seat at the table, you know, despite their developing expertise in local recovery. The barriers to community groups gaining access to funding were also repeatedly raised, most notably the burden of grant seeking and reporting requirements on tiny volunteer groups and the lack of funding for long-term recovery and adaptation. And the burdens from this lack of structural support are carried disproportionately by the women who tend to lead these groups, you know, and who are often stepping back from paid work and careers for months post-disaster, or on the other hand, you know, trying to juggle grant seeking and supporting disaster affected community members while also working in parenting. And this feminisation of community rebuilding recovery and its corresponding lack of formal recognition was something else that was noted by some of our participants. So in the next slide, there's a couple more quotes. Someone from the Northern Rivers commented, the experience of prioritising it in the messaging of like, oh, these men in their dinghies, what heroes. But here we are with just simply 1 trillion women doing all of the childcare, all of the cooking, all of the soft labour, literally everything, plus being on dinghies. And there's just nothing for us. The sustainability of recovery is such a feminised, deprioritised aspect And a Blue Mountains participant commented that my early thinking is that we need to quantify this invisible sector in monetary terms, in the same way that we need to quantify care more effectively in monetary terms, and lots of work that women do that isn't quantified, and have a look at the economy as it really stands. So in summary, community-led disaster organising plays a specialised, sophisticated and indispensable role in disaster response, recovery and adaptation. It's women-led and it reflects the gendered nature of disaster response. And its lack of recognition and support reflects the lack of recognition and remuneration of feminised domains of labour, such as caring and community work. So I'll hand over now to Beck to add the insights from her own research.
Thanks so much, Emma. So Emma's been looking at what community organising looks like. I'm going to step out and look at the wider sort of governance ecosystem from a gendered perspective. This draws upon a study that I led between 2019 and 2023 across 7 local government areas in the Northern Rivers. And the main aim was to investigate the enablers and obstacles to collaborative responses to climate change and disasters at the local level. And during the period of time that research took place, there were fires, numerous floods, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. And when I say governance, I really mean who makes decisions, how are they made, what processes are in place, what information is used to make those decisions, and whose voices are heard in the process. And I should also mention that I forgot to mention before, I'm now working with the University Centre for Rural Health along with Emma in Lismore, and undertook my PhD research through Griffith Uni. Next slide. So just broadly speaking, the rationale for this research really, I guess, stems from, looking at 2015, 2016, there was an explosion of global frameworks, the Sendai framework, the SDGs, the Agenda for Humanity, and subsequently the Grand Bargain and the emphasis on localization. And all of these different frameworks have a few things in common. They really emphasize the importance of integrating climate change, disasters, and development decisions. They talk about the important role of local actors and communities where the impacts are felt the greatest. And a big emphasis, and we know that there's a whole SDG goal around partnerships, the need for multi-stakeholder collaboration to address the scale of the challenges that we face. And so really, I wanted to take that down to the local level and look at, well, what does that mean in practice, and what is being practiced already. And the next slide we'll go to. So the overall research question was really, what are the characteristics and outcomes of local level collaboration for addressing disasters and climate change in the Northern Rivers? And what factors might further enhance its effectiveness? So I really looked at the mechanics of what was going on. I wanted to show in the next slide the methods, just because I really did draw upon lots of different data sources. It wasn't, at no stage did I pretend to be an objective outsider. I was an embedded ethnographer looking at, I used public events, took notes, of course, due to COVID, many online events as well, undertook interviews across different levels of government, state and local government, businesses, incorporated First Nations, community perspectives across all of the data sources. And importantly, I also drew upon 26 hours of footage from inquiries related to the flood response undertaken by the New South Wales government. And there were public hearings in Murwillumbah, Ballina and Lismore, which were incredibly useful. Next slide. So going into, I guess, as I said before, this presentation really gives me a chance to dive deeply into the gendered theme, which I only managed to skim in the publication that I produced in relation to this research. So one big theme coming out was the challenges of being heard within decision making. So there's a reflection here from one participant that said, I just think that sometimes the men seem to be perceived and listened to more than a woman doing the same thing. Another within local decision making said, so here we are, 3 women, and the other 9 blokes have decided that these 3 women are just hopeless. We're going to say no to everything and that they suggest. They wouldn't even barely listen to us. So I also wanted to note, and this really picks up also and emphasises, supports Emma's findings. There was a really noticeable presence of women in community care and volunteer coordination roles, and the scale of the disaster meant that usual support services disappeared. And I should mention, I think, Emma, you mentioned it was 1,300 people were displaced. It was 13,000 people displaced, and that was just in formal, number counting. There were, the flow-on effects were enormous across the region. There were elderly residents that were without any home support services for months, for example, and often their services were flooded. The organisations that provided the support were flooded, or in some cases their houses were deemed unsafe for support staff to go and visit them. And so in many cases, communities, and usually women, filled those support gaps for often months. And the formal recovery support services in terms of case management didn't properly come on board for many months. And so I think there was a real difference that came out in terms of the definitions of certain words and terms that are thrown around. Often in emergency services, there's the term welfare check, which has a very limited scope. And when the responses from communities were being talked about in terms of welfare checks, it was about, does anyone in my street need food? Does someone need help cleaning out their house? Does the elderly person who lives down the road need a lift to the recovery centre? Does the single mum in my son's class need a breather? And so there was a really different definitions for the same terminology that was being used. Yeah. So the other tension that came out a lot, and if you can go to the next slide, please, is the tension between the cultures of top-down emergency management and community recovery principles. So this is a really telling quote. It was all the boys' club. I remember sitting in one meeting early on, and every face in the meeting was a white middle-aged guy with a buzz cut. And I was like, there is no women, there is no diversity, there was no sense of community or that whole recovery space. It was very response lights and sirens mentality, and no responsibility in terms of community collaboration at all. So there was emphasis on the dominance of males in the official emergency management decision making, and experiences of men not allowing women to be fully at the table, and diversity was certainly problematic. So some of the key findings, gender and protection were not identified as issues to be taken seriously within disaster response decisions, which ultimately put women, children and priority populations at risk. And this really is in stark contrast to international settings and the emphasis that's placed on gender and protection and social inclusion. There was, in terms of the recovery space, there was often a huge, I would call them a pivot point at the local government space of these recovery and resilience officers, who often played a pivot point between, vertical and horizontal interactions between government agencies, between NGOs, between communities, and a feeling of uncertainty around ongoing funding for these key roles that enabled information flow. There was inputs of solutions by women, and this was mentioned quite a lot in different contexts in disaster and community resilience settings, that the inputs of solutions by women about women were triggering dismissive responses. Next slide. So despite all of these challenges, there was an overwhelming finding that these challenges also led to innovation. So female leaders that felt their ideas weren't being heard initiated participatory processes to incorporate wider perspectives and buy-in. There was a perception of a top-down state-level decision-making that created issues at the local level. And there were some incredible examples of women looking at collaborative solution seeking at the local level, bringing in government, politicians, different organisations to try and address the problem that was being caused at the local level. There was also a big theme across the research on a feeling of being let down by state and federal government climate policies, which led to female-led local action to address climate change, including both mitigation and adaptation. I'm putting a question mark here because I don't want to reinforce gender stereotypes, but there was, respondents noted numerous times women's inclusive style of leadership. So here's a quote here. I don't know if it's my bias as a woman, but I kind of feel like when there's more women in the room than men, there's much more inclusion in a style of approach of a conversation and when the decision gets made and that kind of thing. Another one, and this was actually a male interview participant, said, you just have to look at who was there at the community centre, who was taking the charge, that was leading it. It was an all-women operation and it was lovely. I think there's a level of empathy and a level of just getting in there and getting your hands dirty and making things happen that women have in that sort of a role more so than men. And other women described themselves as the mortar between the bricks. So there was some amazing examples of unholy alliances between very siloed government departments, bringing together farmers, environmentalists, lawyers to address really complex environmental issues that were exacerbating disaster risk, and some, phenomenal examples of that occurring. There was also examples of community building and finding joint language and vision across different community organisations beyond the language of disasters to try and work together to help communities to thrive. And this really emphasised, I think there was an emphasis on the lack of funding on soft skills development that are required to really address complex challenges. So this last slide is a general diagram. A lot of participants talked about what collaborative leadership meant to them. And there's all sorts of traits there around deep listening, empathy, sharing leadership, being vulnerable, empowering others. And there's representative quotes there. And I realised when I was putting this up there that all but one of these quotes are from women that were interviewed. So I'll just go to the next section, which is really just sort of some bigger picture insights from across, I guess, both of our research really, is that it's really important to think about the bigger picture context of growing climate risk and the fact that what happened in the Northern Rivers is possible in other areas too. And these disasters aren't going to go away, and it will be increasingly likely. So how different actors interact before, during and after disasters is really important. And some key enablers of collaborative forms of governance that people mentioned included the importance of personal mindsets that value the contribution of others, mutual respect, relationship building, investing in soft skills development, and organisations dedicating time allocation to collaboration. And these were seen just as important as the high-tech, high-cost solutions. And collaboration between different types of actors in these situations enhances information flow, and it can mean that responses and recovery can be needs-based. And what I'm advocating for here isn't radical at all. It's widely employed in the international humanitarian settings, and we can learn a lot from how the international cluster system works and how NGOs coordinate and value add in humanitarian settings, and also from the emphasis internationally on gender protection, social inclusion, and the attempts to reduce violence and leave no one behind. Currently, Australia spends 98% of its disaster-related funding on response and recovery, and there's a really desperate need to move from a reactive to a proactive management of disaster risks, including in regular day-to-day decision-making. So in the next slide, I just want to go over some really promising steps, you know, taking into consideration all that's happened in the last couple of years in the Northern Rivers. There's some really great initiatives underway. I'm just going to touch on a few to try and address some of the challenges in terms of information flow and in terms of, you know, bringing different stakeholders together. So there's been the establishment, for example, the council runs a community resilience network in the Byron Shire. There's been the establishment of a community hubs, or the CHUBS group, under the Byron Community Resilience Network. Those different place-based resilience hubs meet up in advance of a community resilience network meeting, and then share their activities and needs with the broader stakeholder government agencies there. As Emma mentioned, there's a Northern Rivers Community Resilience Alliance in formation, which was really heavily identified as a need to bring together different place-based resilience initiatives for solidarity, for sharing resources, you know, just being able to, you know, get a disaster preparedness checklist from another location stops reinventing the wheel over and over again, and looking at collective training needs, and even being able to jointly potentially advocate as well. There's been a lot of work on improving emergency communications across communities, improved Starlink access, radio access. There's been a lot of work on communities also presenting to and linking with local emergency management committees. And there's efforts to support and develop community leadership. There's an example of Plan C, a local not-for-profit, worked on a community carer and responder program that trained 270 community leaders and connected them across the Northern Rivers. And around 70% of those participants had been flood affected and 30% of them bushfire affected. The Red Cross is doing a lot of work on establishing community resilience teams, for example. There's some amazing initiatives underway across the region. And so I think it's really important to leave on the point that these broader governance strengthening initiatives underway, especially given that community recovery and resilience building is gendered, these governance initiatives that seek to include communities and not-for-profits ultimately strengthen the involvement of women in decision-making. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I think we've got lots of chats, questions that I've seen there as well. There's our details. I think we'll also share some links to the reports linked with these pieces of research as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Bridget.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you so much, Emma and Rebecca. There is so much in what you've presented. And I can imagine that, you know, we could easily have you know, a separate webinar with Emma and a separate one with you where we could really dig into some of your findings and some of the conclusions that you've made. Emma, a question for you, and I think probably, Rebecca, you could answer this as well, so perhaps I'll get you both to respond, but do you think there'll be a time when our disaster responses do include civil society roles and do start to include those not-for-profit community organisations and that sort of grassroots level activity?
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, I think as Beck's last slide indicated, there are already movements for this to be happening. And I think that one thing that certainly happened in our area is that the experience of such a large scale and catastrophic disaster has really prompted a lot of reflection and learning across the board, across the spectrum of people involved in disaster response. And that includes the combat agencies, it includes the government agencies, and of course it includes community who may have been stepping up and into this space for the first time. So I do think that it is certainly a question that is on everyone's minds. And the million-dollar question, of course, is then how do we do it effectively? How do we effectively facilitate increased collaboration and communication between these two, essentially these two sectors? You know, there's the formal emergency management sector, and then there's this growing community-led sector, which has its own expertise. And like, you know, where it pains to emphasize from our research, this expertise is specialized, it's unique, and it is critical. It's critically needed. So, you know, I think there is awareness of the need to move towards that point, and there are many initiatives underway, you know, to try to do that. And it's an area that you know, that requires ongoing attention and future research. And in fact, we managed to gain a small piece of extension funding so that we could continue this research that I've just presented on. And in this current phase that I'm working on at the moment, I'm actually going and talking to people in the emergency management agencies to gain their perspectives on precisely this question. So I think it's definitely something that a lot of people are aware of and working on.
Fantastic, Emma, and very much a sort of a watch this space in terms of the Northern Rivers region, because, you know, there is so much happening. It was such a massive impact. And it'll be interesting to see, you know, whether those approaches can be scaled up or replicated, you know, across other parts of the country as well. Rebecca, what are your thoughts about those?
Yeah, look, I think also sometimes it comes down to definitions as well. You know, it depends what you define response as. You know, that lots of emergency services train for years to have the skills that they do, and no one's saying that they will be replaced in any way. They're absolutely needed and often, you know, under-resourced. I think it's probably a recognition of the reality that we're facing, that, and, you know, successive flood and bushfire inquiries have shown that, you know, government agencies can't be everywhere all at once. And so, you know, for a very long time, I think Australians have expected if you know, call 000, someone will be there. And that's not always the case in large-scale disasters. And there's also a certain level of understanding the context and, you know, the landscape that we're in and the future we're heading towards. And, you know, I think Northern Rivers had, you know, a huge reckoning. And so there is a level of people saying, well, we want to stand up. We want to do something about this. We don't want to just sit on our hands anymore. And there is, you know, even in as I was talking about the community carer and responder program evaluation, there is something magic that happens that can transform trauma into hope and action by working together and solution seeking together.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca. And I guess for both of you, again, there's a great question here around the media and what influence the media has on our focus of those kind of hero narratives, you know, the blokes in the dinghies, the blokes with the fire hoses, rather than those kind of care responses over the longer term. Emma, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, and this is obviously, you know, the media is always looking for the interesting angle, and you know, so the coverage is of the daring rescues and the, you know, the high risk situations. I think it reflects more broadly, and this is really something that, you know, we've wanted to emphasize from our research, the importance of recognizing the community-led sector is key to finding ways and having the motivation to work together. And I think there has been assumptions about what the community-led or what community involvement in disasters looks like that can, you know, is sometimes fueled by the way media reports as well, which does tend to portray it as this kind of, you know, mob descending on a disaster scene, and, you know, community is conceived of as a mob of individuals who are kind of running around and trying to take part in heroic actions, potentially creating more risk and so on. And, you know, what this research and other research is really uncovering is, in actual fact, there's this whole body, this huge body of community work, which is largely women-led, which is playing such a critical role. So I think, you know, it's about reframing, and the media has a role to play in that by focusing on those stories. I mean, there have been some very good stories highlighting, you know, the kind of grassroots groups that have mushroomed in the wake of disasters and have, you know, spearheaded local recovery in their areas, but more of that is needed.
Thanks, Emma. Rebecca, did you have any thoughts?
Oh, I think, I mean, it links also back to that point. I think one of the quotes that Emma talked about was, you know, doing the economic assessment of the caring role and the role of volunteering. I mean, if you actually did the figures in terms of the contribution of hours that people put in across the Northern Rivers, it was phenomenal, and continues to be. And I also think, you know, it's also, I mean, the media is obviously has a role, but it's also about the narratives that we as different organizations, you know, contribute to the media, and what we, you know, try and emphasize, and the hooks that we try and use. And so I think we've all got a responsibility for, you know, using the conduits that we have and the communications channels that we have to you know, shine the spotlight on other things.
Yeah, the art of communications, Rebecca, it really is key. I've got another question here. Where to in terms of improving diversity, gender equality and inclusion in disasters and the disaster management sector? And what are the risks of not improving if we just continue on as we were? Rebecca?
Yeah, this is so important, you know, and again, I mean, I think that's really having linkages to different governance arrangements is really important. So recognizing that there is information that is available at the community level that can contribute to understanding the needs on the ground. But also there's an emphasis even on, you know, place-based community initiatives being inclusive as well. And so there is, you know, an element of needing to understand the diverse needs within communities and looking at, you know, who participates in different governance arrangements. But there's certainly, I mean, that coordination and asking those questions, you know, having those conversations about, you know, what the needs are on the ground, and working together to address those, you know, still advocating, you know, 2 years on for the needs of, you know, certain members. I'm thinking of our local community who have slipped through the cracks, basically, and, you know, who might not have accessed the support services for all sorts of reasons. Even thinking about, you know, in those initial phases, there's a lot of assumptions made about people's ability to get to recovery centres, for example. there were lots of examples of, there was women who were caring for their children who had disability, who didn't want to go into the recovery centres because they were worried they were going to bring back COVID and affect their child with a disability. So, lots of really complex stories, and how we can ensure those different needs are met is really important lens to put on, emergency response and recovery.
Right, thank you, Beck. And Emma, a question for you. As part of your research, are there any potential responses or changes that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I think that the key things that community organisers were asking for over and over again from across the 3 sites in our research were for recognition and support from formal emergency management agencies. And this, comes both to the question of, like I said, acknowledging what the community-led response actually is, that it's not just a bunch of chaotic individuals, through to how can we plan to more effectively communicate and collaborate with them during the next disaster. So looking at what kind of systems and structures can we put in place and so on. Funding was also a key ask. And this is not just funding for the groups that that mushroomed after the disaster, but addressing how funding is provided. The fact that small groups who came together as a bunch of volunteers, like I said, maybe some of their leaders just simply stepped away from their jobs for several months because they realised this was such critically important work and there was really no one else to do it. And then down the track, as people get burnt out, realising we need to access some funds to help with this, and then experiencing all manner of obstacles. They can't access grants because they're not incorporated, or even when they are incorporated, they're too small and they're overlooked. The burden of grant seeking, of understanding the grant writing process, of burdensome reporting requirements, and of the prioritising short-term response and recovery funding rather than long-term recovery and climate adaptation funding, etc. So it's the whole package. That was something else that was really spoken of. In terms of the gender dimensions, I think that having this kind of conversation is a key step. I think both Beck and I mentioned that Australia, sadly, is lagging behind in this area. Internationally, gender is absolutely recognised as a critically important dimension in disaster response. And I saw I'll just see if I can, there's a great quote, excuse me, in the Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines. The tyranny of the urgent in the post-disaster context means gender is often overlooked in emergency response. And I think that is what we see here in Australia. We're a privileged society. We have more gender equality than many other societies around the world. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a critically important conversation to be having. And now is the time to be having it, because now is the time when we are experiencing these more catastrophic disasters and we're realising we need to do things differently.
Absolutely fantastic response. Thank you, Emma. I might just throw to you both for any closing reflections or comments, because we are at exactly on time and I know people are having to leave. Beck, over to you.
I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion, and I really wish we had another hour, to be honest, to have a conversation between everyone. I'm especially interested in hearing about what this means in different contexts across Australia. And so if anyone is, keen to reach out and have that conversation, I'd love to hear, how this manifests in different parts. Yeah.
Fantastic, thanks, Beck. And I would encourage people to reach out. That's what this network is for, is to connect women doing great things. Over to you, Emma.
Yeah, look, I'll just echo what Beck says, I think this is such an important discussion. As I said at the beginning, you know, I sort of first thought, oh, I don't know if I can say much about gender, but I really wanted to be part of this conversation. And, you know, just looking at all the faces here today, I would so like to hear other people's perspectives, insights, experiences. So thank you so much for, you know, for hosting this conversation, and yeah, let's take it forward from here.
Absolutely. Our absolute pleasure to have you both, Beck and Emma. It's been fantastic. And as you say, I think we could have easily talked for another hour. I just wanted to let people know that you can visit the support page on the OAR website for information and resources around gender discrimination, particularly in the workplace, if anything today has troubled you. And if you'd like to know more about the links between family violence and disasters, as well as some of the other great work that the Gender and Disaster Australia do, make sure you pop to their website. So that's Gender and Disaster Australia. Of course, we all here have extraordinary lived and professional experience within emergency services and disaster resilience agencies, organisations, institutes, and a whole range of other areas. We're all about sharing and connecting here at the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. So please do reach out to our presenters, contact us through our website, info@oarnetwork.org.au. And we absolutely hope to see you at our next webinar in a month's time, if not before. Thank you so much, everybody, and goodbye.